Hey, good day viewers. What I've got here is a 2007 Saab 9.5. Kind of a fun car, but also kind of a pain in the butt. But anyway, we're looking at the alternator has died on this thing, so looking at changing the alternator. And as I look at this, I'm like, how am I supposed to change the alternator? I can't even see it. But it's there, it's down there somewhere. So what we're going to do is you want to jack up the vehicle, take off the passenger side front tire, and securely support the vehicle on jack stands. And then what we're going to try to do to try to get to where we can access the alternator is take off this top motor mount brace here. And there's a 18 millimeter nut that we've got to take off. There's two on each side, 16 millimeter bolts that got to come, and then there's also a 10 millimeter bolt that also has to come. So, but before you take that all the way loose, what you want to do is actually support the engine, since you're taking off the top support. And what I did, and you want to use a block of wood. It's kind of dark, you can't see, but I put a block of wood there, kind of on the edge of the oil pan, not in the center, because you don't want to dent it. You want to have it on the edge where it's rigid and strong. But I just put a block of wood under the floor jack and supported the engine there. And at some point I think I might even have to maybe raise the engine up a little, but this will allow us to move the engine up and down to maybe give us room there to get at that alternator in there. So anyhow, let's get going on this. Alright, so we've got the top motor mount brace off. It's out of there. Now we can kind of at least maybe start to see the alternator is down in there somewhere. There's our brace. Just set it off to the side there. So now what we want to do is we want to get the serpentine belt off. It's going to have to come off, so let's get it out of our way. And how to operate the tensioner on this to release the tension and slip the belt off. The tensioner's right here. And what you want to do is take maybe some extensions. I think 1/2 inch will fit in there, or 3/8. I think I've got 3/8 here. And what you want to do is just pull toward the front of the car, and that'll release the tension. Let's see if I can't get another hand down here and hang on to the camera and slip that belt off. Yeah. So I've slipped the belt off, as you can see. And now I can just relax, let the tensioner go. So that's how you get that belt off, so it's out of your way. Okay, so now that we've got the serpentine belt off, that top motor mount brace out of the way, we need to get this belt tensioner pulley, or actually the belt tensioner, the entire assembly, out of the way. And I'm going to be honest, this isn't easy, but it's doable. This is where you want to take the jack and just raise up the engine a little bit from underneath where we've got the floor jack under the oil pan. So raise it up a little bit. What that allows you to do is get to that Allen bolt that holds the tensioner on. And I scrambled around and kind of thought for a while, and what I came up with as a solution is I could get a 5.5, or excuse me, no, it was a 6 millimeter Allen wrench, fit that. Maybe a hex head socket. It's awful tight. You might be able to come up with something with a special hex head socket and maybe turn it with a wrench or something. But what I devised is actually just a 1/4 inch deep weld socket that I put on a handle, and then I slipped that over the Allen wrench to give me enough leverage to bust that loose. So something similar to that might work for you, and I was able to break that loose with that combination. So here we are. We've got the tensioner pulley out of the way. That gives us a little more room down there. Now we can actually, over here, you can actually see the alternator back there. And so what we want to do is disconnect. There's two wires that go to the alternator, and we want to disconnect those wires before we unbolt the alternator. So you can work it. One of them, if you stick your hand down there on the back of the alternator, you can feel it. You might be able to work on that one from either the top or the bottom. What I'm going to do now is just go down underneath here, and we'll see if we can get a look at these. The older I get, the less I enjoy crawling around underneath cars and doing this kind of stuff. But there you can see the back of the alternator. You see the smaller wire there at the bottom that is in, well, let me square up the camera. Okay, it's on the left, shining my light on it right there. Looks to be an 8mm. And then up there a little bit higher, I've got the light on it. The other wire looks to be a 10mm. So we want to work on getting both of those wires disconnected from the alternator. Okay, we'll do that now. Alright, so we've got the wires, the two wires from the alternator disconnected. And I lied. The top one ended up being a 12mm, I believe, instead of a 10. But the bottom one is an 8, so you'll need an 8 and a 12. Now that the alternator, the wires are free, we can work on the two bolts that connect or that fasten the alternator. There's a piece of plastic in the wheel well. I've got it here. I'm not going to show or demonstrate taking that out for the purpose of this video, but it's just this that piece of plastic that kind of fills this void right here. There's some 8mm screws that fasten underneath to the frame and stuff, and then one up here that fastens it. So you want to get that piece of plastic down and out of the way, and you'll see then you can access the bottom alternator bolt. It's down here, and what it is it's an 8mm hex head. Pull that apart. I've rigged it up. So there it is. You want to take an 8mm hex head socket to get that one, and then the top one is not quite as easy. Just try to show you here. You'll kind of even have to feel for it, but down there below this pulley and near the tensioner pulley, if you'll stick your finger back in there, you'll be able to feel the top alternator bolt. And it's actually, just to kind of orient yourself, it's pretty much directly above the bottom bolt. So maybe stick your socket in the bottom one. That kind of orients you. The top one is directly in line with that and just above. And to kind of help me with that, I actually got out the new alternator and oriented it the way it's mounted in the car, and it mounts about like that, pretty much straight up and down there. So that'll help you find the top one. It's a little more challenging, but should still be able to get it loose with the 8mm hex head socket. Okay, you can see here I've got the bottom alternator bolt out there, shining the light on it back there. The top one is not so easy, but I'm just going to show you what I did. If you look down in there, you can see kinda, let me get the camera, you can see the end of my 8mm hex head socket. I'm shining the light on it right there. So I wiggled my hand down in there and then slipped that back in there and slid it into, snug into the hex, internal hex head bolt or Allen bolt, whatever it is, or whatever you want to call it. So now I'll put my driver on the end of this and crank it loose. Just a little on-the-fly update regarding that top alternator bolt. So what I ended up doing, and you'll want to do this probably right off the bat to get that, is I ended up taking off the rest of the tensioner assembly. Earlier on, we took off the pulley, which got us in there and gave us room. But I ended up, because it was just fighting me too much trying to squeeze in and get to that bolt. So I unbolted the rest of the tensioner assembly there. And let me slip it up out of here. And basically it's held in with an 8mm hex bolt. It's kind of tight to get in there. I broke it loose with a ratchet, but then I ended up putting on one of these little doodads, 3/8, just that allows you to be able to spin that socket with your fingers, and just kind of turned it, and it was kind of slow, but I just turned and got it out of there. So just a tip there on getting that top alternator bolt out. Okay, so another note on that top alternator bolt, be careful with it. This was the second time. I'm the second owner of this car, and the alternator had been changed before, and as you can see, it's recessed back in that this little hole, and it's an 8mm hex. And I found that when the alternator was changed before, that the bolt was rounded out a little bit, the hex points, and it was extremely tight. And anyway, long story short, what ended up happening when I went to break that bolt loose is it was already rounded. It rounded worse and ended up getting completely stripped out. In fact, here's what it looked like. So if you're careful and your bolt isn't rounded out or stripped in any way, you should be able to get that bolt out without too much trouble. But I did run into some trouble. And what I ended up having to do is I ended up having to take off the bolts for the alternator bracket. The alternator bracket has 4 bolts. There's one here, one down there, and 2 up here, and then there's one in the back. Well, I couldn't get to the one in the back because the alternator was in the way, so I was in a real pickle. But what I ended up doing is just prying on the bracket and breaking that ear off that holds the last bolt on. And not ideal, you know, a broken alternator bracket. I thought maybe I'd order a new one. But I ended up, actually, my brother is a welder, and he was able to weld that ear back on for me. And nice weld, it's good as new. And it's actually kind of a good thing, because what I also discovered when I had that bracket off is that this top motor mount had cracked. And I didn't notice it, but just wear and tear over time. And so while it was off, he was also able to weld that so that it didn't crack out anymore and cause a problem down the road. So once I had that off, and what you'll do, you won't have to hopefully take the alternator bracket off, but I just pulled everything up from the top. The alternator and the bracket and everything, and it was tight. These AC condenser lines, it's really tight, squeezing it up through there and against here. These PCV oil lines, I had to move and manipulate those around, but you can get it out of there. Just make sure you have the motor jacked up a little bit to give you a little extra room, and you can pull that sucker out from the top and drop the new one in from the top, which you can see I've done. I've already dropped the new one in. I've got the alternator bracket bolted up, and I've got the alternator bolted on. So the rest of it, obviously, just put it back together in reverse, that it came apart. It goes together, and it seems like a lot quicker than it actually comes apart. So I hope this video was helpful with somebody else out there with a Saab 9.5 changing the alternator.